Chapters 13 and 14 of the Maxwell Mystery, by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 13. The Mysterious Missiles. I went in search of some of the servants and learned from them two important facts. First, that the library had not been swept since Monday night, although it had been dusted. Second, that the maid who dusted it distinctly remembered seeing the bronze paperweight in its usual place, and also asserted that the large inkstand was undisturbed, and that it did not need refilling. With this new knowledge, or rather with this corroboration of previously attested statements, I went to the library, determined to discover something if I had to remain there all day. First, I looked at the bronze horse as it stood in its place on the library table. This table, which was really a flat-topped desk, was covered with books, writing implements, and bric-a-brac of various kinds. The bronze horse was one of a half-dozen different paper-weights, and was a beautiful specimen of its kind. I picked it up, and gazed at it intently, wishing it could speak for itself and solve the mystery. As I stared at it I suddenly noticed that one ear was broken off. It was a very small bit that was missing, indeed scarcely enough to impair the beauty or value of the ornament. But if that missing ear could be found on the library floor, it would be a pretty fair proof that Mildred had thrown the horse in the way she had described. Eagerly I went in search of the maid whose duty it was to dust the library. In response to my questions, she told me that the horse had belonged to Mr. Phillip, that it was one of his favorite possessions, and that it was comparatively new. She had noticed the day before that the horse's ear was broken. She could not say positively, but she thought that if it had been broken before that she would have known it. Excited at the prospect of something like a real clue at last, I returned to the library and began a systematic search for the missing ear. Getting down on my hands and knees in the space between the desk and the window, I searched inch by inch the thick Persian rug, and was finally rewarded by discovering the tiny piece of bronze that I was hunting for. Comparing it with the other ear, indeed fitting it to the very place from which it was broken, I saw there was no doubt that I had succeeded. And though I could not imagine how the horse had been replaced on the table, I could no longer doubt the truth of Mildred's assertion regarding it. Carefully wrapping the broken ear in a bit of tissue paper, I put it away and devoted my attention to the inkstand. The large and elaborate affair stood in the center of the table. The inkwell itself was of heavy-cut glass, and was mounted on an ornate silver standard, which was also a pen-rack. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt convinced that nobody could disturb the ponderous ornament and restore it again to its place in the way Mildred told of; for it held as much as a small cupful of jet-black ink, and even though the Persian rug was of an intricate design and small figures, yet it was light enough in its general coloring to make ink spots perceptible. Helpless in the face of this assurance, my eye wandered aimlessly over the articles on the desk, when toward the right end and not far from the bronze horse, I spied a second inkstand. It was heavy, but not so large as the other, and had no silver standard. I opened it and looked in, and found it to be nearly half full of red ink. I looked again at the rug. The predominating color was red in varying shades. Instantly the thought struck me that if Mildred had thrown that inkstand, and if there had not been much ink in it, the drops on the carpet would be unobservable because of the similarity of color. Without stopping to inquire how it could be restored intact to its place, I dropped again to my knees and again searched for traces. The pattern of the rug being so complicated and mosaic-like, it was almost impossible to discover red spots other than those which belonged there. But at last I thought I did find on a small white figure red blotches that were not of the Persian dye. Almost trembling with excitement, I procured from a drawer in the desk a fresh white blotter. Moistening this, I placed it on the doubtful red spots and gently pressed it. Then, lifting it, I found that it showed dull red blurs which had every appearance of being red ink. Reserving further experiments of this nature to be done in the presence of witnesses, I went in search of Mr. Hunt. He had not yet arrived, so I telephoned him to come as soon as he could. Meanwhile I returned to the library to think over my discoveries. I admitted to myself that they gave us no enlightenment whatever, but they had proved the truth of the only doubtful parts of Mildred's story, and left us therefore no excuse for not believing her entire statement. Hunt soon arrived, and was more than pleased at what I had done. "I knew you had ingenuity," he said in his honest, generous way. "Now I don't believe I should ever have thought of that blotting paper scheme." "But what good does it do?" said I. "Granting that she did throw them, how did they get back to the table?" "That is another part of the problem," said Hunt, "and one which we need not consider at this moment. First, I think if you have any more of those clean white blotters, we'll find out the route traveled by that inkstand." I found plenty of blotters in the drawer, and proceeding with great care, we succeeded in getting a blotting paper impression of many more red ink spots. We proved to Mr. Hunt's satisfaction, and to mine, that the inkstand had reached the floor about midway between the desk and the window, and that it had then rolled toward the couch, and had stopped just under the long upholstery fringe which decorated the edge of the couch, and which reached the floor. "That gives a ray of light!" exclaimed Hunt, triumphantly. "What do you mean by that?" said I, wondering, for I could see no indication of light. "I can't tell you now," said Hunt, "for some one is coming. I think, Mr. King, it will be wiser to keep these discoveries quiet for the present. Indeed, it is imperative that we should do so." And so, though I wanted to go at once and tell Mrs. Whiting that I had proved her sister's statements true, as she had said I would, I restrained myself because of Hunt's advice. It was Thursday morning when one of the servants told me that Mr. Hunt wanted to see me in the library. I went there at once, and found the detective in conversation with a pretty and very much flustered Swedish parlor maid. "This is Emily," said Hunt in a quiet voice. "She has been telling me of something in which you will be interested. Emily, repeat your story to Mr. King." The girl fingered her apron nervously as she stood before us, and spoke with embarrassment and hesitation. "It was this way, yes. I have the day after the dying of Mr. Phillip. I have to dust in this room. I sweep not, but I do the dusting. And under a chair, yes, under that great soft chair with the fringes, I find the jewel, yes. And oh, it is that I cannot confess." The girl buried her face in her apron and seemed unable to go on. "There, Emily," said Hunt, gently. "You kept the jewel and said nothing about it until now. But let that go. We will forgive your stealing the jewel, now that you have confessed, if you will tell truly everything you know about it. This is the jewel, King." He placed in my hand a large topaz set as a seal. It was not a ring, but seemed to me to be a pendant of a watch fob. "It's part of a fob," said Hunt, "and I want you to look at the design." The design, deeply cut into the stone, was a crest, coat of arms, and motto, that I realized at once belonged to the house of Clarendon. Without a doubt, it was the property of our noble visitor. "It is the Earl's," I said simply, as I handed it back to Hunt. "Yes, of course. And now, Emily, tell Mr. King where you found it." Reassured by the forgiveness of her theft, the maid showed us where she had found the seal, beneath a chair near the library window. Heavy fringe hung to the floor from the upholstery, and the seal, the girl explained, she had found just inside the fringe on the rug. "So," she said, "I have moved the chair when I dust him, and I see the sparkle stone. Yes, I pick him up, and wickedly I put him in my pocket. It is bad, yes, but I'm tempt, and I fall. But you forgive, you say so." I took little interest in the maid's somewhat dramatic recital, for I was intent on learning just when she had found this thing. It seemed she had found it early Wednesday morning, before I myself had looked for clues, and had found the black spangles. Since she had dusted but not swept, she had not noticed the spangles; but the seal had naturally attracted her attention as being valuable, and she had dishonestly kept it. "Hunt," I said, "there is one thing I can swear to, and that is—" "Wait a moment," said Hunt, giving me a warning glance. "I think that is all, Emily. You may go now, and understand you are forgiven for this theft, only on condition that you tell nobody a single word about the matter." "Ah, that I am only too glad to do, yes. I do not want that any one should know my baseness. I thank you much, sir, for your goodness, and never, never will I tell." She left the room, and Hunt closed the door. "It may not mean anything, after all," he said, "for Lord Clarence may have dropped that thing in the library at any time during the day on Monday. It doesn't implicate him in any way, but I wanted you to hear the girl's story." "You're wrong, Hunt. It does implicate our noble friend. As I began to say, I can swear that Lord Clarence was wearing that fob himself at about 9 o'clock Monday evening." "Great goodness!" exclaimed Hunt. "Do you really mean that? How do you know?" "Because he showed it to me especially. We were in Mr. Maxwell's study. I remember the people were just beginning to arrive for the dance. We happened to be speaking of seals, and Lord Clarence showed us this one, as a specially fine example of gem engraving. So my lord was in this room that evening. But it might have been before the murder, King. He might have come in here casually, as others did, before Philip and Miss Leslie were here. But he said at the inquest he wasn't in this room all the evening. And you know he didn't come up here when we rushed up. He stayed below, and looked after the guests. I thought that it was a particularly clever thing for him to do, but now— And also his lordship has about half an hour on the west veranda unaccounted for, just at the time of the murder. Don't you remember he said he was smoking a cigarette, and a long grey motor whizzed past him, and all that? It looks a little queer, King." "It looks more than a little queer, Hunt. But I can't help thinking there's some commonplace explanation for it, after all." "How can there be a commonplace explanation? The man had that seal on, you say, at 9 o'clock. He says he was not in the library that evening at all. Next morning early, Emily finds the seal here. What's the explanation? I don't know, I'm sure. But what I say is, let's put it right up to him. I know if anybody found evidence against me, I'd rather they'd come straight to me with it, than go nosing around. And I think that Clarence personage is a good deal of a man. You know I never did share your great admiration of him." "It isn't a great admiration, but I think he's a right good sort. And I think the fairest way is to take this seal to him, tell him where it was found, and give him a chance to speak up for himself." "I'm not sure that's the best plan," said Hunt doubtfully. "But you know him better than I do, so I'll agree." Hunt put the seal in his pocket, and we went downstairs in search of Clarendon. It was nearly noon, and Philip's funeral was to be held that afternoon at 2. Even as we went through the hall, quiet-mannered men in black were unfolding chairs and placing them in rows. The oppressive scent of massed flowers was everywhere, and it seemed incongruous and inappropriate to pursue our errand in this sorrowful atmosphere. In the study we found Alexander Maxwell and Miss Miranda. The brother and sister were much together, and oftenest in the study, seeming to prefer to be alone there in their grief. Miss Maxwell looked up as we entered, but, as often happened, Mr. Maxwell did not hear us, and so did not turn his head. Not wanting to intrude, I said quietly, "We're looking for Lord Clarendon. Do you know where he is?" "He has gone," said Miss Maxwell. "Lord Clarendon gone? Where?" I cried, unintentionally raising my voice in my surprise. And then her brother turned and saw us. "He has gone home," said Mr. Maxwell. "He remembered an important engagement that called him to the city, and after explaining to my sister and myself that he must go at once, he went, leaving his adieus for the rest of you." 14. In Pursuit of the Earl. Here was a fine state of affairs indeed. The Earl, whom we wanted so much to see, was gone; and it seemed to me, and I was sure Hunt felt the same, that his going was, in a way, suspicious. "Why did he go so suddenly?" I asked. "He had to," returned Miss Maxwell. "He didn't say definitely what his engagement was, but he said it was important." "I have an idea," said Mr. Maxwell, that he didn't care to stay for the funeral. You know how queer Englishmen are that way, and I dare say it got on his nerves." "Nerves nothing!" I exclaimed. "That man is mixed up in the shooting of Philip, and now we've let him get away. Hunt, tell Mr. Maxwell the circumstances." So the detective told the two interested listeners about the finding of the seal and the conclusions we must draw from it. "You see," I said, "I know, and you do too, Mr. Maxwell, that the Earl was in this room wearing that seal at about 9 o'clock Monday evening. Early next morning it was found in the library. The Earl denied having been in the library all that night, and so you must admit an explanation is called for." "But I can't think that the explanation would prove Lord Clarendon guilty of the crime, or even accessory," said Mr. Maxwell, looking thoughtfully at the gem he held in his hand. "He had no quarrel with our boy." "He greatly admired Miss Leslie," I said, knowing it to be the truth. "But he had only known her a day or two," broke in Miss Miranda's gentle voice. "He couldn't possibly become so infatuated in that short time that he would commit a crime for her. And besides, he's a nobleman." The good lady had always been deeply impressed by the glory of the Earl's title, a truly American weakness; and she could think no ill of one who rightfully displayed a coronet. But to my mind the fact of his being a foreigner, and a titled one at that, rather argued against him; though I realized that my prejudice was quite as illogical as Miss Maxwell's. "Aside from any possible motive," said Hunt, "we have to explain the discrepancy between the Earl's statement that he was not in the room and the finding of a piece of his personal property there. You returned the fob to him after looking at it, I suppose?" "Certainly I did," said Mr. Maxwell, a little shortly. "But I cannot agree that the finding of it in the library implicates his lordship in our tragedy." "What, then, would be your hypothesis, sir," said Hunt, "as to finding it in the library?" "My hypothesis, Mr. Hunt, would be that the maid Emily did not tell the truth, rather than that the Earl of Clarendon did not." "I hadn't thought of that," I said. "To be sure, that girl might have made up the story, but I can't see why she should do so. She would have kept the jewel, but that Mr. Hunt, in questioning her about her dusting of the library, surprised her into a confession. She is simple minded and emotional, and her confession, I am sure, was entirely truthful." "It may be," said Mr. Maxwell, coldly, "but I cannot think that logically you have any more reason to assume truthfulness on her part than on the part of the Earl." "Emily might have found it somewhere else," suggested Miss Maxwell. "Then why make up that story?" said Hunt. "I don't know, I'm sure, unless to make a sensation. She's a queer girl, and I've never understood her." "I'm positive that she did not make up that story, dear Miss Maxwell," said I, "and I know if you had heard her you would agree with me. But I am willing to admit that there may be and probably is some commonplace explanation; and whatever it may be, we must know it before we go any further. Do you know where the Earl has gone?" "Yes," said Miss Maxwell. "He went to New York. I think he is staying at the Waldorf. At least that's where he was, just before he came to us." "Then I'm going straight there to see him," I declared, "and I shall start at once." Hunt looked his approval of this, but the other two did not. "I don't think you'd better, King," said Mr. Maxwell, slowly; but Miss Maxwell grasped my arm impulsively and said, "Oh, don't go, Peter. Please don't go until after the funeral, anyway." I couldn't resist her pathetic appeal, and I agreed not to go until after the funeral, but I insisted on my plan of going then. "Did the Earl say good bye to Miss Leslie?" I asked Miss Maxwell, pausing as I was about to leave the room. "Oh, no," she answered. "Milly is very ill again. The excitement of that talk with you this morning threw her into a high fever, and we are all very anxious about her. I told Lord Clarendon this, and it was after that he told me he was going." "Because of it?" asked Hunt suddenly. No, of course not. In fact, he left a message for Milly in addition to his good-bye, to the effect that she would be glad he had gone." "What could he have meant by that, Miss Maxwell?" "I don't know, unless he felt that his attentions to her had been unwelcome, and she would be glad to know he was gone." "No man's attentions are unwelcome to Mildred Leslie," I said, "and I don't think that's what he meant at all. I tell you, Miss Maxwell, that man is mixed up in our trouble, and Milly Leslie knows it. Suppose, for a moment, that it was the Earl who shot Philip, wouldn't Philip exclaim, 'Oh, to think he should shoot me!' And wouldn't Milly, if she knew or suspected it, be glad to have the Earl go away?" "Peter," said Mr. Maxwell, somewhat sternly, "your suggestion is monstrous. I should be angry at you, were it not that your idea is so absurd. You are carried away with your desire to detect somebody or something. Now, my boy, put this all out of your mind, at least for the present. This afternoon we shall give the last honors we can to our Philip, and after that it will be time to turn our attention to avenging the crime that took him from us." Mr. Maxwell's manner was impressive, and I felt rebuked that I should have obtruded my theories and suspicions at this moment. I said as much, in an apologetic way, and then Hunt and I withdrew. "You're dead right, Mr. King," said Hunt after we left the study. "It was his noble Nibs that turned the trick. And I hope you will track him down at once. You can take that 5 o'clock train to New York, but even so he has hours the start of you. I wish the old people would let you go now." "No, I can't offend those gentle souls by insisting on that. But I'll go up this afternoon, Hunt, and I'll find that man, unless he has really fled from justice." I don't care to dwell upon the sad rites of that afternoon. It was hard to realize that we were gathered there to pay the last honors to Philip Maxwell. He had always been so alert and alive, so light-hearted and debonair that it was difficult to think of him as dead. And the mystery of his death added a peculiar horror to it all. But at last the ceremonies were over, and I was free to go away if I chose. I hesitated about discussing the matter again with the Maxwells, for I knew they would oppose my going to New York on such an errand. And though I might persuade them that it was my duty to do so, the argument would doubtless be a long one, and I might be late for the train I wanted to take. So I asked Hunt to tell them that I had gone, and to say that I would soon return. I advised him, too, to tell them that it was the most straightforward thing to do. For if the Earl could give a simple and rational explanation of the question of the seal, certainly no harm would be done. And if he could not, surely the matter must be looked into. And so I found myself in the train, returning over the road that Miss Gardner and I had traveled a few days before. Naturally my thoughts strayed to her, for mysterious though she was in some ways, she had made a greater impression on my heart than ever woman had done before. I ascribed her strange ways to her strength of character, and her cold logic to her high order of intellect. If a thought crept in that she knew more than she had told about the mystery, I determinedly put it away from me. It seemed to me everybody was acting mysteriously. Mildred Leslie was inexplicable. Her rapid transitions from gay thoughtlessness to feverish hysterics surely denoted guilty knowledge of some sort. Miss Lathrop was queer enough, too, but of course she could know nothing about the crime, except what she had heard from us, or what Mildred had revealed in her delirium. Irene was strange. Gilbert Crane had acted very strangely, and certainly Lord Clarence's behavior was astonishing. However, I didn't really think the nobleman had done the shooting, but I did think that he knew something about it that he preferred not to tell, and so had put himself beyond questioning. Before 10 o'clock I was at the Waldorf, inquiring for the Earl, only to be informed that he was out. He had left no word of his whereabouts at the office, but as he still retained his rooms I decided to wait for him. The clerk told me that he had come to the hotel that afternoon about 4, and later had gone out, apparently, to dinner. But though I waited until midnight, his lordship did not appear. Again I conferred with the clerk, telling him I was especially anxious to see the Earl of Clarendon. He was not greatly disturbed over my anxiety, but was willing to do what he could, and suggested that I interview his lordship's manservant. This was a truly brilliant idea, and I directed that the valet be sent for. But the response was that Lord Clarendon's man, by name Hoskins, was not at present in the hotel. "Did he go away with the Earl?" I inquired, but this nobody seemed to know. The Earl had left at about 6 o'clock, and as it was now 12, all the porters and bell boys had shifted, and no one at present on duty could give me the information I wanted. Nonplussed, I told the clerk that I would go to his lordship's rooms and wait for him there; for secretly I had a hope that I might learn something from an examination of his apartments. But permission to do this was refused me; and then, though I didn't want to hint my suspicions openly, I gave the clerk to understand that it was in the character of a detective that I wished to see the Earl's rooms. Whereupon the clerk nonchalantly asked to see my badge. As I had none, not being a real detective at all, he seemed to consider the interview closed; and realizing I could do nothing more that night, I asked for a room, and went to bed. I rose the next morning with a firm determination to find the Earl. Surely such a personage could not drop out of civilization without leaving a trace; and he had kept his apartments at the hotel, so he evidently intended to return. But to sit and wait for him was not my plan. I went downstairs and inquired for him at the desk, but, as I had anticipated, I received no information whatever, except that he was not at present in the hotel. I thought it over as I ate breakfast on the sunny side of the dining room, and at last a brilliant idea came to me. I was determined to do real detective work in this matter, something more than merely making inquiries of a secretive clerk. My brilliant plan might not prove successful, but after breakfast I put it at once to the test. Going up in the elevator, I stepped off at the 4th floor where the Earl's rooms were, instead of going on to my own on the 9th floor. I knew the Earl's apartment was numbered 492. I managed to get to its door unobserved, and then stood there hesitating, as if just leaving the room. I stood thus for some time, but my patience was finally rewarded by seeing a chambermaid coming along the hall. "Ah, there you are," I said, stepping briskly forward. "Now look here, my good woman, I find that I put an important paper in my waste basket by mistake. When did you empty the baskets?" "Last evening, sir," she said, looking a little alarmed. "It should have been done earlier, sir, but I got behindhand with my work, and—" "Never mind. Show me the place where the papers were thrown. They're not burned yet, are they?" She hesitated, but a powerful argument that was green and crisp induced further information. "They're in a sack in my broom closet, sir. But I'd be fined if it were known." "It shan't be known, I promise you. There's no one about. Show me where they are. I want to see the contents of the basket that was in 492. "They're all together, sir, but that room is near the top. Step in here, please." I followed the woman into her broom closet, which proved to be a small but fairly well lighted room. She took up a large sack and tossed part of its contents out on the floor. "Will you search yourself, sir? I must be at my work." "Yes, my good woman, go along. I'll find what I want, and no one will be the wiser." She went away, and I began the well nigh hopeless task of looking over the waste paper. But after a time I began to find torn envelopes addressed to the Earl of Clarendon, and these I examined with interest. There were many invitations, advertisements, and personal letters, but none seemed to bear on his present absence, until I struck a note from one Mrs. Ogleby Pauncefort. This was an invitation to her country house on Long Island, at Osprey by the Sea. The lady asked Lord Clarendon to come the afternoon before, and as I found also a time-table with the railroad station checked, I couldn't help thinking that his lordship had accepted her invitation. At any rate, I found nothing else to give me any idea of where the nobleman had gone, and I resolved to go to this place, and if he were not there, perhaps to learn from Mrs. Pauncefort where he might be. Making use of the discarded time-table, I started at once toward my destination. But taking the first available train, it was 11 o'clock when I reached the ornate mansion at Osprey by the Sea. The footman who answered my ring informed me that Mrs. Pauncefort was not at home. "Is the Earl of Clarendon here?" I inquired. "No, sir. He has been here all night, but he went with the party in the yacht." "Ah, in the yacht," I said, endeavoring to assume an air of intimacy with the family. "What time did they start?" "At 10 o'clock, sir." I looked at my watch. "Then they've been gone about an hour," I observed. "And where are they headed for?" "Montauk Point, sir." "Montauk Point? Why, they can't reach that till late this afternoon." "No, sir. They will lunch on board the yacht, and reach the Point by dinner time; or, I should say, perhaps at tea time, about 4 o'clock, sir." He was an amiable sort of man, and as he probably thought me a friend of the family, he was giving me all the information he could. I said. "I wonder how I could catch up to them. Could I get a motor boat anywhere?" "I don't think you could overtake the Butterfly that way, sir. She's a clipper. But of course you could take the train." This seemed to be the only thing to do, and I turned away and went back to the railway station. If I had only risen earlier and started sooner I could have found my Lord Clarence with no trouble at all. But there was nothing for it but to keep on to Montauk Point. I had time before my train went to send a telegram to Hunt, in which I told him that I was making progress and was on the trail of the Earl. End of chapters 13 and 14.